Dear Lord, we are thankful to be able to come together, and I'm especially rejoicing tonight that Leonard reached out and that you helped him to get set up to where he can join us. And I pray that stay the case for him to be able to catch up someone on what he's missed out on, and to help him, Lord, to understand quickly and give us the skill of being able to lead him through these studies, that he could take them by faith, understanding that whether or not he's hearing your voice, Lord. And we just ask a special blessing upon his understanding tonight and upon all of us as we go through these reviews. We're so thankful for the light that you have shined upon our path in guiding and directing this movement. And the journey that we've been on, Lord, it's just been amazing. And I am so thankful to be a part of it. We praise you and we thank you and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so the dogs will hopefully settle down in a minute. If not, I'm going to kick them out. Nicely, I'll kick them out. Okay, so we're going to review a couple of from the Germany 2020 camp meeting. Ones that I thought would be helpful for Leonard. And let me just, there we go. I'll move a couple things off my screen. Okay, so this was Germany 2020, December 2020, January 2021. And it was In God We Trust, and it was the first place she discussed In God We Trust was in Brazil, at the Brazil School of the Prophets, and then in the camp meeting, and then also I believe in Guadalupe. So about a week ago, and Leonard, what I'm going to be reading is basically a transcript of her, what she said, and then the board work is on here for us. So about a week ago, 2 documents were shared in the media broadcast. This is a group in a what's called WhatsApp. It's a forum where messages are shared. Hey guys, stop. Where messages are shared, and there's a forum in there in a media broadcast group that all the members of this movement are in, and documents are shared there for us to read. So that's what she's referring to. So the first one was how the Constitution became Christian, and the second one is Church and State, the Early Republic. So and if you're able to receive emails, I can send you these documents because I have them in my files here. So it's the first document, how the Constitution became Christian. That's the focus of our attention. The second document will help to give some context to the first. So what we're going to do is work through that first document and supplement that history with other documents so we can build a broader picture of particularly evangelical history. I say this at the beginning of every presentation. What we are teaching in these classes, in this class, is built directly upon what we've been studying since May through other camp meetings, and particularly the last presentation. It's all one continuing theme. If we aren't familiar with these presentations, this one will be much harder to follow. We're building on these studies. So not to scare you away, but I told you can call me and we'll talk privately if you have questions as well. Okay, so I always try to begin by trying to show where we are on our reform line. And so a little revision or a little review. You have 1989, 2001 or 9/11, the Sunday Law, the close of probation, and the Second Advent. And so this is actually the line of the 144,000, how the development of it has grown since you've been with us. There are on the line of the 144,000, there are 5 waymarks: 1989, 2001, Sunday Law, close of probation, and the Second Advent. We are not yet here, but I know you're familiar with the terms of priests, Levites, and Nethinims. And this is the line of the priests, which are those that are in this movement at this time, those that have stayed and endured and remained at this time. And those waymarks always are going to be the 5 main waymarks, and we'll explain the little ones later. But the 5 main waymarks: 1989, 9/11, 2014, which I'm pretty sure you were around when we were beginning to understand 2014, then 2019, which we knew as Raphia at the time, and then 2021, which we knew as Panium at the time. So this was the line of the priest, and Panium is this where it says F up here is the formalization of the message. So on the line of the 144,000, the formalization of the message for the Sunday law, you have an increase of knowledge coming on the Sunday law and then a formalization. And this is where we're at here, is this formalization. This was, this little person walking was last year, and we have progressed to this formalization of the message. And the message for the 144,000 is the increase of knowledge that it began in 2019 and is formalized, that is about the Sunday law. So let's see. That's the line of the 144,000. We know where we are, but we are also on another line of the priesthood. It's the first fractal, and we discussed fractals a few weeks ago on the Sabbath series. We understand ourselves on this fractal to be in the time of trouble. And that's easy to imagine between the increase of knowledge and the formalization. So this period here, because we understand the 5 main waymarks, which means 4 dispensations, a dispensation here, a dispensation here, a dispensation here, and a dispensation here, 4 dispensation, and they line up on the agricultural model with a plowing, a former rain, a latter rain, and a harvest. That's the 144,000. So when you take that same agricultural model and bring it to the fractal, you have a plowing, a former rain, the latter rain for the priest began in 2014, went to 2019, and this was the harvest period, which is also the time of trouble, because we know when you get to a close of probation, you have a time of trouble. So this is the time of trouble. But within this period of time for the priest, there's an increase of knowledge and then a formalization of the message. So I know that may seem confusing. Just absorb what you can. Go ahead. Somebody gonna say something? Somebody gonna say something?
Yeah, I don't know how clear my audio.
I hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I have a question. So, we're in the time of trouble, but it's not the time of trouble that happens after the close of probation on the priest line. And so kind of what I'm trying to grasp is, and we can see it's a time of trouble, so I'm clear on all that. But you know how 9/11 is a harbinger. So would our time of trouble between 2019 and 2021 be a harbinger time of trouble compared to the one that's going to happen after the big close of probation? Ellen White has quote about a little time of trouble preceding the big time of trouble. And I always wondered about that quote, you know, where she talks about a little time of trouble just before the big time of trouble. Anyhow, that's kind of been a question on my mind for a while. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, other than to just say that this is just the priests here, because then you have the Levites and they're in a time of trouble, and then you have the Nethinims, and this is their time of trouble, and then this is the time of trouble for the 144,000. So it's just one big long time of trouble from 2019 till the second advent. But the big time of trouble is here. That's the best that I know to say right now. I don't know if that answers.
So yeah, I get what you're saying. And each time of trouble, it's probably going to increase, right? It's because we see it increasing even during our time.
Right.
So I'm sure it's going to continue to increase in intensity.
Right. And the priests go through the whole thing. The priests, Well, the faithful priests will be among the 144,000, and they will go through the whole thing. If those that endure till the end, they will go through the whole thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so within the time of trouble, there's an increase of knowledge. And that's another story that we might try to study or review with you, Leonard, later on the Apis bull study, but it had to do with idolatry, the idolatry that goes on in the apostate Protestantism, and the idolatry that that Adventism partakes of by following apostate Protestantism, and the idolatry that is within our own hearts as well, and the things that we've had to learn that need to be let go of. And so it's been kind of a difficult process at times. And if everybody always remembers that quote that Ellen White said, we have much to learn and much to unlearn. Unlearning is painful, because unlearning means you had something wrong. And we've found that we've had so many things wrong as God's character becomes more and more clear. So this was the increase of knowledge on the Apis bull study, and then the formalization of the message. But you have a formalization up here for the 144,000, and it's the increase of knowledge, the formalization on the understanding of the Sunday law. So that's what we've been coming to understand more and more clearly, is what the Sunday law looks like in on this big line. Okay, so let's see. But we're in the increase of knowledge and formalization on two different reform lines. Right here is the increase of knowledge for the 144,000 and the formalization. And in this little period of time here is the increase of knowledge and formalization for the priest. So we experience this all the way through. Let's see, if you trace the presentations, you can see them weaving between these two thoughts, that we're bracing ourselves for two different distinct formalizations. I know somebody I need to send that quote to tonight that asked me that question. So we are bracing ourselves for two different distinct formalizations. We stand here, and we know that now we're more like here, heading towards the formalization of the priests for the second advent. And very soon after that, we reach the formalization that's designed to prepare us for the Sunday law. And that's this one that I was mentioning up here. This increase of knowledge was particularly May to September this year, and it is the Apis bull study as that developed in Oceania between May and September, but it continues to grow and swell.
And we just passed our formalization, right? For the
Right.
priest on August 15th.
Right. And the formalization, right. And then the formalization for the Sunday law is actually Panium, which is right in front of us. So at the French camp meeting, the point was made that we have two institutions established at Eden. Two institutions God has had to reestablish before the next Eden, the Sabbath and marriage. So Sabbath and marriage were the two institutions in Eden established for Eden, because they did not exist before Eden, before sin. They did not exist before Eden. They were given to man, the institutions, and both institutions must be restored at the end, before the end. So there are two histories for modern Israel. There's an Alpha, the Millerite history, and an Omega. That's us in this line here. And what is happening is there's a reestablishment of the Sabbath in our Alpha history. That was the Millerite history, and then the 1888 history in particular, and reestablishment of marriage in our history. So the Sabbath was restored in the Millerite history, actually in Adventism history. When you go back, I mean, it was 1846, correct? But the battle over it was in 1888. So it was established in the Alpha history, and marriage is to be restored in our history. So if the Millerites had done their job properly, we would have understood the Sabbath, gone to heaven, sorted out marriage, and in 1,000 years. But that didn't work. So we do it here on earth. The Sabbath and marriage, twin institutions. And we have laid out, they've laid out clearly that Christ was to come in 1863. I have a couple of good presentations transcribed on that too, that Christ was to come in 1863 and then somewhere in the 1888 history. So had he returned, had they not failed in their job, had he returned, the Sabbath would have been restored, but marriage would have been understood in the 1,000 years. We would not have known this issue that we're dealing with now until we were already in the 1,000 years. So all of Adventism, looking at the Sabbath in 2015, they decided not to ordain women, and at the same time, they opposed gay marriage. You can see they have an issue with marriage, and they're not doing well with the second institution. And some of the stuff that I did talk to you this afternoon about was the sexism issue. And so what we've come to understand through these lines, comparing them and contrasting them, understanding that the issue over women's ordination and gay marriage were correct issues to be addressed. And Adventism failed at the women's ordination. They held on to, we might say, their Apis bull, their wrong understanding of of equality and women's roles. So let's see here. The same as ancient Israel, they grabbed hold of the Sabbath. That's their focus of attention when Christ comes back. In fact, they know this so well, they make sure that they kill him before the Sabbath starts, because you wouldn't want to break the Sabbath by killing God on it. So you're going to kill him on Friday, get all your work done before the sun sets. So you have this acceptance of the Sabbath issue with marriage. So two institutions, one is restored in the Millerite, in the Alpha history, the Millerite history, and then marriage is to be resolved in our history. Someone in the chat is talking about 1,000 years. If someone doesn't think it's going to take 1,000 years to sort out this problem, I would suggest inequality runs that deep. I'm at the point of thinking this is going to take 1,000 years. I didn't think we'd be at this stage in 2 years. I thought many more people would get it, so I wouldn't be surprised by the 1,000 years. I hope that we're excited at the thought of how much we still have to learn, entire subjects that perhaps God doesn't think we're ready for yet. I said that to make one point. This increase of knowledge and this formalization down here on the priest line is the training of the first group to go to work, and we're teaching people about marriage. So the subject of marriage is the key concept of the message in each history, from the formalization of the midnight cry to our increase of knowledge and formalization. So that would be the midnight cry back here. And it will continue to be as we approach the Sunday law. This increase of knowledge from May to September, it's also important to be watching the studies in Wales. It was neither planned nor a coincidence that the theme of the studies in Wales have been on marriage from the beginning, addressing some practical issues connected with this message. And for Leonard, that was it began as a Q&A that Elder Parmenter was doing on certain Sabbaths. I think there was a time where it was each week. I don't remember, but he did quite a few of them, and a lot of information was shared there and brought out about the issue of marriage, the practical issues and that connect to this message. So whether it's that series in Wales on marriage or the Apis bull, which is idolatry, we've been preparing for that 1,000 years. What the Apis bull series started with in May, it was meant to be a study that brought us to Millerite history. And it was done, and it has done that, but I kept getting sidetracked because as we began in 1798, there were other themes that we were tracing. What began to happen was, instead of focusing just on Millerite history, we could see that there was a thread of Protestantism connecting 1798 to the present day. I'll describe it this way. When was the time of the end? We know that was 1798 because Ellen White says so. Even when she's outside of, Ellen White is able to say, even when she's outside of a reform line, but she's in the time of the end. So this was the time of the end, and all this period was to be the time of the end. Where it ended was the success or failure of God's people. So Elder Parmenter has taught all of this. When you look at the time of the end, you can see it structurally as 1798 or 1989. Dates that begin a reform line, but the way you'll find Ellen White use that phrase is that the time of the end began in 1798 and extends all the way to the Second Advent. So humanity has been in the time of the end since 1798. You can use two different ways. Ellen White doesn't have visibility on Daniel 11:40, Part B, as being 1989. She has no visibility of World War II, let alone 1989. She's going to use that phrase as 1798, extending all the way to the Second Advent. So we can see it structurally, but this progressive thought also makes sense. The time of the end does not start and then it ceases to be the time of the end. If 1798 is the time of the end, and this is the Second Advent, then how can all of this not be the time of the end? Because otherwise, what end is it talking about? I'm going to use the second concept that we've been in the time of the end since 1798. This is a history that is prophetically loaded. The Second Great Awakening, Millerite history, the Civil War, all the history leading up to World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. There's so much happening. The formation of modern European countries, the fall of monarchy, the introduction of communism, and all these events occurred in this time period here, in the time called the time of the end. And what I was talking about earlier, Leonard, is that's all the external that was never even looked at. And I remember it actually being specifically said that there were no external events for Millerite history. And that was so very wrong. As we've come to understand, there is so much information that has guided this movement, looking at the external events, that has corrected many, many things that needed to be unlearned. And when you unlearn something that's incorrect, you're replacing it by something that is correct, so you're learning. And before God gave us prophetic glasses, we would not have seen World War I or World War II as having anything to do with a great controversy, which makes no sense. And as we understand this time of the end prophetically, we see that all this has everything to do with the great controversy as both sides prepare for the end. So all of these events that took place prepare both sides for the end. To break down this history, this fight, God has given us different parabolic structures, different models to break down this history and help us make sense of it. Different structures with different themes to make different points. I want to give 3 brief examples. We can look at this history of the time of the end, and how we usually go to that history would be to say the alpha history. The 1888 history, I think that says 1888. Yeah, sorry, had something in my way. So the alpha history, the 1888 history, and the omega history. That's our history here. And that's all quite neat. And it was failure, and success. We've understood that from some of the previous studies as well. So you have Egypt, Babylon, Rome, it's rock solid. And you see the interaction in these histories between Adventism and Protestantism, dealing with the issues of inequality in both the Alpha and the Omega. But it's not the only structure that God gives us to break down the time of the end. We have the lines of the counterfeit. So over this we can see that Satan counterfeited the Alpha history, or attempting to. It took him until the 1888 history with the World Wars, then 1888 to 1989, and then our history from 2001. This is the counterfeit, and we'll see more of that in the next study if we see, depending on how far we get. So it's going to break down the time of the end even more. God is giving us more models to try and help us to see the great controversy in the time of the end, in the history since 1798. So you have the Millerite history in the time of the end. You have the history of the counterfeit that takes place, that has been traced, and then you have the history of Protestantism that it takes place and has been traced. We won't be using either of those models in this camp meeting. The model that we will use was introduced last year, and it was developed from our understanding of 2014 as midnight or midway or a midpoint. The title for those studies was called In God We Trust. And through two methods, a study was developed that highlighted the 1860s to 1900s time period, the 1940s and 1950s, and then 1979 to the present. So here we have the lines drawn out from In God We Trust that was taught, showing us the beginning of the National Reform Movement in 1863. We know what that led to. Next, the 1940s and 50s, and then 1979 to present. We were taken to those three histories from using 2014 as midway and prophetic time spans. From 2014, the 151, 2014, the 151 takes us to the beginning of the National Reform Movement. And to try to make a side note, I don't want to overload you too much. The 151, you may remember some of that, but it came from a study on the Daniel 5, many, many tekel upharsin, understanding that in one place in the Bible, the many was 50 shekels, and in, I think it's Ezekiel 46, a many was 60 shekels. So when you do the math on it, with the 60 shekels, it brought you to the number 151, and it became a prophetic symbol of the 2520, as did the 126 when you use 50 as the shekel and do the math on that. So the 2014, or the midway point, how we understood a midway point was looking at Millerite history, how you had the 6 months that took place here from when they had made a mistake here and thought that Christ was to return. Then they discovered the tarrying time. And so Ellen White wrote in the Great Controversy, I think it's in the Great Controversy, that July 21 was midway. So it was exactly 3 months and 3 months to October 22nd. And that developed, from that developed this midway. So from the midway point is how some of these studies came out to understand of the Civil War history. You had 1861 to 1865 for the Civil War history, and 1863 being the midpoint. There were other midpoints. I'm going to just touch on that one and this last one here, where we're able to take 2014 as midway between 9/11, the tarrying time, and the tarrying time, to then 2019, a shut door. And down here, October 22nd was a shut door. So we marked it as a midway point using the Millerite history here. And the 1863 in this midpoint was the formation of the National Reform Movement. And just as another side note, I ran across some quotes in the spirit of prophecy where Ellen White connects the National Reform Movement with the work of the third angel, and in a pretty amazing way. I don't have them handy. I don't think that they're in this study, but she definitely linked the work of the National Reform Movement as needing to be looked at and understood. And people were actually saying that if we look at that, it'll take our eyes off of what we're supposed to be looking at. But she was directly saying that's what they were supposed to be looking at. And that's what we've come to understand to be so true, especially as we've read through so many of A.T. Jones' documents as well on the history of who the National Reform Movement was, and then their role that they play in 1888 as well. Okay. So the other midpoint was this is one of the midpoints here, but she has others on different lines. So let's see. So from 2014, the 151 takes us to the beginning of the National Reform Movement, and the 63, which is the 63 was the 126 cut in half, takes you from up to the epicenter of the 1950s crisis. So this 63 was a half of the 126. So the third model, I'm sure there are more. The third I've mentioned today is the model that highlighted 3 time periods where there was an evangelical movement to change the United States, to mobilize political power, and whatever came with that. We may tend to think of that as just being a Sunday law. So keeping it simple as a Sunday law, where the evangelical movement mobilizes political power to do a work. And we've been looking, and that's what we're going to look at, is those 3 movements, those histories that they did that in. And this was her board work, busy as it is. I'll try to go through it, what I do remember of it. But if you think of this as all one big line, just she drew them out separately. You have 1861, and there are reasons because she's linking and connecting things, but you have 1861, and then 1863 and 1865. So you've got this midway point. It's basically the same thing I just had on that screen. They did the "In God We Trust" stamped on the coins. This was when they first called to put Christianity or religious inscription. They were trying to get it something done, and then they came up with the slogan. It would be "In God We Trust" on the coins. And then in 1864 they did it, and then you have 1865 here. This would be the Civil War history. And then I don't want to touch on all this because some of it will be, some of it will add too much to what we're not going to focus on tonight. So then we have 1948 to 1954. This was another, she did several midpoints along here. 1948 is when they put "under God" into society. Let's see, introduced to society. The Knights of Columbus had "under God" in their Pledge of Allegiance, I think it was. Maybe somebody can remember if that was what I'm saying. They had their own personal Pledge of Allegiance and they put "under God" in there. And then in 1954, "under God" is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And then what we learned from the Civil War history is the purpose of the National Reform Movement was to the saying that one group is saying that the nation is being punished because God is not in the government, and we need to put God in the government. And that's what brought about putting this Christian stamp on the money. And that was the work of the National Reform Movement, that God is not in government. And Ellen White was saying that the Civil War was judgment because of slavery. So the issue here was slavery. The issue here was slavery. And you have 2 conflicting opinions or thoughts on what is happening. Okay, so then you have the same issue going on here with Protestantism. Again, saying that this nation needs to come back to God, need to return to God. And so that's what brings about the "under God" being brought in and then eventually put on a Pledge of Allegiance. So these are movements, major movements by the evangelicals to put God into the government, which means what? Somebody answer that question. What does it mean to put God in the government? Oh, you guys know this answer?
We're talking about the image of the beast?
Yeah, which is what?
Church and state.
Church and state, right? So when you put God in the government, you're designating, you're defining, you're making it church and state. And that was their push, is to make it church and state. And yet you'd see the National Reform Movement say that's not what they were doing, but that's what it was. They had a lot of different funny ways to say that that's not what it was, but that's what it was. So, and then I think it's in 1956 when they put "In God We Trust" on all the money, on the paper money as well. So then you come down here to 1979 to 1989, you have the moral majority, the issue of the moral majority with Jerry Falwell and Liberty University. You have the issues over racism and gender. 1989, you have Ronald Reagan on one side, George Bush on the other, and the Christian Coalition. 1994, you have the Clinton Chronicles. 9/11. 9/11 happens, and now they're going to mobilize again, because 9/11, they say, just like they did in these other histories, that this is because we took God out of the government, and we have to put God back in the government. So the movements were to to make an amendment to the Constitution, to not really so much worried about, I don't want to phrase that wrong, just kind of an acceptance, but I'm not wording this one properly. Maybe somebody better remembers how to phrase that. But this was this big push to change, make an amendment. But by the time you get down to here, they're not even trying to make an amendment. It's just about how they interpret the Constitution. So they're interpreting the Constitution as already Christian. And now we need to stand on our Christian Constitution when it never was Christian. So, so this 9/11 begins this push, again, another mobilization. So you've got these histories being mobilized, the evangelicals mobilizing to bring God in the government, to make an amendment, to changing how they interpret the Constitution, to finally just accepting this already is a Christian nation. We need to recognize that. So they start this push to put "In God We Trust" in the schools and everywhere else. So I think I'll stop right there, at least with this board. And the national reform was nationalism. Reform is to make it great again. And what she put on here, number 1, "In God We Trust." Number 2, Bible history and specific days. And number 3, protection, discrimination, marriage, LGBT, and transgender. Those become key, and I'm not going to explain them right now. I want to leave that just kind of as a thought there. But they do become key as to their movements to make America great again. The national reform is to make America great again. And we all can see clearly what they believe America great is today would be a white Christian nation. And we read a lot of that as well in the A.T. Jones documents, showing us that from the very beginning, they did not want people immigrants coming to this nation from particular places. They didn't want immigrants coming from Eastern or Southern Europe. They wanted the ones from Northern or Western Europe. They would be better citizens, better qualified, better workers. And they didn't want to bring in the poorer classes and to drag down this nation. So the racism has been there all along, and not just against Blacks. Okay, so coming back to our line, the increase of knowledge in the Sunday law is 2019. So on our line, this is the priest line, you have the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law. Let me see to make sure I'm right here, is 2019. So the increase of knowledge on this big line, sorry, is 2019. Somebody go ahead. What are you going to say? Somebody gonna say something? Is that a no? Okay. So the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law is 2019, and that's on the 144,000 line. So this begins the increase of knowledge for the Sunday law event, and to come to understand what this looks like in our day. We've already said these waymarks or time periods. May to September here for us. When did the increase of knowledge for the 144,000 on the line of the 144,000 begin in 2019? So when did it begin here? When did this increase of knowledge of the Sunday law begin? And she suggests it started in February of 2019. And if for those of us that were here in Sacramento, we were at Christina's at that time. No, we were still in the church. That was right before we left the church, right before we, April 2019 is when we were in rescue and baptized. So we were, and this was in Brazil. She's going to say it was in Brazil. So we were just getting ready to depart from the church at that time. So what did we see in February? February was the Brazilian camp meeting. And that's when I would mark the beginning of the increase of knowledge for the Sunday law. I would say February to August. You could say to September. In August, what we're teaching is equality. It's reached that point, and we know there's no Sunday law. But I would suggest our understanding in February began to transform our idea of the Sunday law, because what were we teaching at the camp meeting? What I find so fascinating is it didn't begin by taking us to slavery to change our idea of the Sunday law. That was August. In February, where did it take us? It took us to 1888, and it told us that Adventism, which is us, does not understand the 1888 history. Most of that camp meeting, I was reading A.T. Jones, quotes of A.T. Jones, showing that we did not correctly understand what he fought for. If Adventism, us, understood 1888, how would we have stood on gay marriage in 2015? So if we understood A.T. Jones, what he was saying, what A.T. Jones' fight was for was not to make a Saturday Sabbath law, but he was defending the rights of all people. He was defending the rights of all people. And so the 1888 history, and there's more to it than that, but that's just without going to prove anything, that's just a quick overview, that standing for the rights of all people. So what would we have done what would Adventism have done, or what would we have done in gay marriage? We would have stood for the rights of all people. And that was all said in February. So this increase of knowledge is going to radically change our understanding of the Sunday law, not in the Adventist understanding that there is the structure, but actually what it looks like. So, and this is a quote, an A.T. Jones quote. Mr. Corliss, I reside in this city, sir, with my family. I speak in behalf of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Washington, of which I am at present the pastor, as a citizen of the United States and as a resident of this district. I appear, not as has been affirmed before you, to speak in behalf of a Saturday Sabbath. Far from it. Gentlemen of the committee, if this bill, number 3854, were to have incorporated into it, instead of Sunday or the first day of the week, the words Saturday or the seventh day of the week, there is no one who would oppose it stronger than I. So A.T. Jones was opposing, would have opposed if they were trying to, if someone was trying to place a Saturday or seventh day Sabbath law. He was going to oppose it all. God is going to begin that work by taking us to the 1888 history so that we could understand what we're supposed to be defending in our history. Making the point in quote after quote that Adventism does not understand the external of 1888. We read the quote of A.T. Jones, who stood in Congress and said, if you were trying to propose a bill that defended the Saturday Sabbath, we would oppose it just as strongly as we oppose the Sunday law. And that is not the approach that Adventism takes to the government today. And you can apply that with what we're looking at with the abortion issue. The same thing again today. It's not the government's place to make these moral laws. The government is to protect the rights, and the Constitution was to protect the rights of all people. And by protecting their rights, all people then will have freedom. But to make a Sunday law, what they were trying to do in 1888, they call it religious liberty, but it's religious what do you call it? Drawing a blank at the word. It's going to be oppression for others. So what might be liberty, they might view as liberty for one. Think Catholic Church. When the Catholic Church was the universal church, what happened when they were the universal church and you were not a part of them? You were persecuted. So what A.T. Jones fought for was to protect the rights of all. And that was him as a Seventh-day Adventist, as the third angel, according to Ellen White, that this was the message of the third angel. And but that was a history of failure. So our increase of knowledge of the Sunday law takes us to 1888 to understand this history. So the increase of knowledge took us back to 1888 to look at A.T. Jones and what did he fight for. Let's see. It was this increase of knowledge. It was not saying we understand 1888, but we've forgotten Millerite history. It was saying we don't understand 1888 and we had forgotten slavery. We didn't even know the Civil War was part of the Great Controversy. So we're having to go through this, what is really quite a steep increase of knowledge. You remember, like I said, if it's an increase of knowledge, it also comes with a unlearning that which you had incorrect. As we go into the study of this camp meeting, we're not going back to discuss Millerite history or slavery. We were trying to do that in May to September, but we kept getting redirected when we began looking at Jedediah Morse and the split within Protestantism. I want to give one example of how we misunderstand. As we get closer to the Sunday law, it stands out more and more in detail. So back here, it's okay. Back here, it's okay to say that Protestantism will do something. But as we get closer to the event, the message refines, and that is far too broad of a statement. So back here, we're going to know that they're going to maybe do something, but we need to have a clearer understanding of what that something is. How can you give a message to warn people when you don't know what it is? So an example, what is your perspective of the World Council of Churches? What I understood is that the World Council of Churches, the sign of the end times, as Protestants came together with this deep state agenda to introduce a Sunday law into the United States. We ignore the split within Protestantism and the fact that many of these Protestants who would call themselves fundamentalists oppose the World Council of Churches, calling it too liberal. That this World Council of Churches is as evil to them as the UN. So they formed the International Council of Churches. So way back here is what she started tracing was this split in Adventism. And we saw that in several of the presentations that there was always this conservative liberal stream. And they came from the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And a Great Awakening, my summary, my thoughts on how best to simply to lay that out is a Great Awakening is going to be nothing more than an increase of knowledge. And when you have an increase of knowledge, you either accept it or you reject it. So they have this Great Awakening, new light comes in. Are you going to accept it or are you going to reject it? So the Millerite history comes in under the Second Great Awakening. Are you going to accept it or are you going to reject it? But you have a conservative faction. You have a people that leave that conservative faction because of these new liberal ideas. So now you have a conservative liberal. And then you have God introducing with the Millerite history. So they have to come out of the conservative mindset. They have to come out of the liberal mindset and they have to join the movement. And it's the same in our history. Have to come out of the conservative mindset, have to come out of the liberal mindset, and they have to join this movement. Because Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. It's not on the left or liberal. It's not on the right, conservative. It's not of this world. Okay, so I don't know if I read all that. Did I read all that? Okay, as an example, what is your perspective? We did read that, okay. So we ignore the split within Protestantism, the fact that many of these Protestants who would call themselves fundamentalists. Okay, we did read all that. So this is the World Council of Churches. Evil is them, is the UN. And so they did their own and created an international council of churches, the conservative side. So Adventism sees these liberal Protestants. They think they're going to oppose these liberal Protestants. We see the UN, we see the World Council of Churches. So we'll stand apart from that and we'll reject the UN and we'll reject the World Council of Churches. Instead of standing apart, all we did was align ourselves with conservative Protestantism, who sees the great threat of globalism, the UN and the World Council of Churches. So conservative Protestantism sees the UN and the World Council of Churches and globalism as a threat. And Adventism follows that line of conservative Protestantism. We have not stood separate from Protestantism. All we did was align ourselves with one stream of Protestantism. And like conservative Protestantism, we stand here looking at the liberals. Here we are, conservative lined up with the Adventism, lined up with the conservatives, and we're looking at the liberals for the threat, who we think is the institute of the Sunday law. So we're looking at the liberals and seeing them as being the Sunday law threat. And this warped worldview, it's just repeating the mistake of ancient Israel. So we need to understand 1888 history and trace Protestantism back from the time of the end. We're going to do that particularly with the first document, that document we mentioned, how the Constitution became Christian. We'll supplement this document with 3 other sources. The first source is the Church and State in the early Republic. The second source we will supplement with will be some references to A.T. Jones. The third source is a book called The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America by Francis Fitzgerald. And Leonard, I have the book, a hard copy. If you would like it, I'd be happy to send it to you. You just let me know. I have this, an audio book. I have it on audio as well. She had it on audio. A lot of us got it on audio. And I can maybe help you figure out how to do that. But I have the hardcover as well. So I don't have time to read, but as an audiobook, it's almost 26 hours and I have not finished it, but it's a very in-depth look at Protestantism, particularly beginning in detail from the Second Great Awakening. It's titled The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America. It's difficult to reference an audiobook of that size, so you may find me just making statements of fact, such as Billy Graham was a fundamentalist, where I won't necessarily prove it, because the laid out evidence is in the 26-hour audiobook. It's published in April of 2017, so it's particularly these 3 other reference materials that we'll use. So Church and State in Early Republic, the references to A.T. Jones and the Evangelicals. And a lot of us, and that's actually what we were scheduled to continue on tonight, was continue our reading in this book here. A lot of us have already read through it or listened to the audio. But it's very eye-opening to the struggle between the conservative, liberal factions throughout this history that we're looking at. There's also much more information in articles and YouTube videos. Just as a disclaimer, we will have to simplify. And whenever you simplify, people can get a little frustrated that they don't think you're going far enough to see the real picture. But I would suggest we always need to cut away the mud. However much we need to simplify, there's quite a simple and consistent thread that we are tracing, this thread of Protestantism. I'm going to summarize. We have been in the time of trouble since 1798. It is loaded history, and we've not realized how much of that history is the final struggles of the Great Controversy, the prophetic nature of those events, from the Civil War to World War II to Reagan, who we can see more clearly. We're in the final events of the final events. God has brought modern Israel, that's us, to the same point as ancient Israel. Adventism is failing in their Omega history. He has the people he's training. we stand heading towards 2 formalizations, which we're already here and almost here. We have been through the increase of knowledge. We have the formalization of the priest, this increase of knowledge. We have the formalization of the priest, and to come to the formalization of the Sunday law. As we approach the Sunday law, it's standing out with more and more clarity as God gives us different models to break down past history leading to future history. We looked at just 3 different models: Millerite, 1888, and the 144,000. The study of the counterfeit as well. But then we didn't look at the counterfeit in detail at all, we just mentioned it. But then it's this third, at least in this study, but then it's this third model, In God We Trust, showing us, regardless of what Adventism is doing, 3 Protestant movements from the 1860s, 1950s, and the present. So you see that in Adventism, you have the Millerite history, 1888, 144,000. You have 3 distinct histories there where Christ was to return in 1863. Christ was returned in 1888, in the 1888 history. We see failure, failure, and success. We see in the history of In God We Trust 3 histories, 1860s, the 1950s, and present. This was a failure, this was a failure, and this will be success.
What?
What is our home phone?
951,
Somebody have a question?
927.
Oh, sorry.
No? So that's all an introduction to the first document. That's just an introduction. She doesn't even go into that document. She actually goes through several studies before she finally gets into that document. It's a big document, and it traces those same 3 histories from a Protestant perspective. The same things that were being taught that she was teaching in February of 2019 are in this document from a Protestant source. So that's all an introduction to the first document, because this first document, the introduction or first page, the 3rd paragraph, says this article illustrates the dynamics that transform conflicts over national identity into constitutional conflicts by examining 3 movements in the long-standing debate over whether the United States should be understood as a Christian nation. The 19th century Christian Amendment movement, mid-20th century Judeo-Christian nationalism, and the new Christian right that began in the 1970s and 80s. So the 3 histories the document covers is the 19th century Christian Amendment movement. That was in that 1888 history. And beginning actually 1863 with the National Reform Movement being formed. The mid-20th century, that's the 40s, 50s, Judeo-Christian nationalism. And then the Christian right that began in the 70s and 80s. And I think that might be all of that one. Oh, we got a little bit more. So it's going to take us back to the 1888 history, then the 50s, and then the present day. The document takes you back to this history. An external source perfectly validating our message, which is what I was just trying to point out. It perfectly validates what was already taught in February of 2019. I want us to look into the author just for a moment. The author is Jared A. Goldstein. He's Professor Goldstein. Professor Goldstein was one of the first civilian lawyers allowed into Guantanamo Bay. He represented several Kuwaiti detainees in Guantanamo Bay. His involvement with those Guantanamo cases, his defense of them, led all the way to the Supreme Court. He's a national expert on habeas corpus. So he's a lawyer, a professor. He's particularly known through his fight against Guantanamo Bay for the constitutional rights of several of the inmates. He's authored numerous briefs for the Supreme Court. He's nationally recognized. He regularly publishes in the highest law journals, and he is a teacher of constitutional law. That's the status of the man who wrote How the Constitution Became Christian. This is not a law student writing for an exam. Very knowledgeable, very experienced. You go through the other articles he's written in 2018, one called the Ku Klux Klan Constitution. In 2018, another article, Unfit, and we read this one, Unfit for the Constitution, Nativism, and the Constitution from the Founding Fathers to Donald Trump. We went through that document together as a group. In that article, he's tracing nationalism from the beginning of the United States to Donald Trump. And this article was from 2017. In 2014, he wrote The American Liberty League and the Rise of the Constitutional Nationalism. In 2011, he's writing about the Constitution and the Tea Party movement. We've discussed how the Tea Party led to Donald Trump. So he's written, that's just a few of them, some fascinating articles, and he's not someone unrecognized or untrained. He's defended constitutional rights through Guantanamo Bay all the way to the Supreme Court. So we're going through this 2017 document, How the Constitution Became Christian. That's just our introduction to this document. Last year, we were given a model that looked at 3 evangelical movements. This document does the same. So she's talking about February 2019. We were given a model that looked at those 3 evangelical movements, the Civil War history, the 50s era, and then present. And this document does the same. It looks at the same 3 movements, but it's going to expand our understanding of that history. It's not enough to know there will be a Sunday law. You have to know what it looks like. Adventism stands on the train tracks, looking at the World Council of Churches and the UN to do something, and not realizing that conservative evangelicalism has had a 41-year head start while we're putting on our boots. If we want to understand this modern history, putting aside the 50s, Adventists know to lift up 1888, so we should understand it. We'll come back to this document in our next study. We'll go through certain portions and address each one of these 3 movements and add in some surrounding context. And I'm gonna jump out of there real quick. We still have you, Leonard, good. Let me just open it up before because we're gonna jump into the 3 structures. Any comments or questions? I know that was a lot of information and it was kind of fast. You gonna can you able to turn your mic on? Leonard? I want to make sure you're still with us.
Can you hear me?
Yep, got it now. Got it now.
All right.
That was a lot of information, but was it pretty easy to understand?
Some of my screen went blank. I don't know what happened. I had to reset it.
Okay, so I closed the screen. I did close our screen, so I took the screen away. So maybe that was it. And I'm going to put up the next one in just a second here. I just wanted to just kind of, because I know I went through a lot of information, but just to get the main point that that she was tracing in February 2019 these 3 movements within Protestantism to push to make this a Christian nation. And by the time you get to our history, they're just going off of their own interpretation and how they read the Constitution. And they read it as if we are a Christian nation. So this guy, Jared A. Goldstein, writes all these articles. We just went through his accolades, basically. And he actually is an external source. I might have said Protestant source. I hope I didn't, but I meant an external source if I said that. He's an external source tracing those same 3 histories that totally validated what she taught in February of 2019. So that's Protestantism, seeing these 3 histories and understanding that in the internal, in our line, the line of Adventism, when you look at the Millerite history culminating in 1863, it was a history of failure. And what she points out that history was about slavery, and that had Jesus come at that time as as it was planned, then we would be sorting out marriage in the 1,000 years, the issue over marriage. But because they failed that history, we're now sorting out that history of marriage that leads eventually to gender equality. Okay, any comments?
No,
Okay. And you can call me anytime to ask questions. Let me, I want to close this out. There we go. Okay. I'm gonna go to this one. So we got like 45 minutes if you're okay to, I don't think we'll get through this one, but we'll try to get the basis of it. So these are the three structures we're going to look at, and the three structures in the time of the end. And this again was a part of the same camp meeting. I gotta move something out of my way again. Okay, so we'll start with a review. We constructed the line of the 144,000, that's down here now, and the line of the priests. So we've got the 144,000 and the priests. We placed ourselves between Raphia and Panium, down here, up here, Raphia and Panium, 2019 and 2021. So between the increase of knowledge and the formalization of the early reign of the 144,000, the increase of knowledge has come last year, the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law, our preparation for the Sunday law. It started in February in Brazil in 2019, and it didn't start by taking us to Millerite history or slavery. It started by taking us to 1888, and it essentially said, you Adventists love 1888 so much, but we do not understand the external. We don't understand the external history and the fight of A.T. Jones, what he and others were standing for and fighting against. We made the statement, we face a similar fight today about church and state. Adventism is on the wrong side, and the litmus test was 2015 on gay marriage. They were not defending the rights of all people. They were standing by and allowing and siding with the government, saying that the government has a right to make these laws and judgments and moral laws against people, combining church and state, as opposed to fighting for their right to decide for themselves. So we started in 2019 with the 1888 history. God entered that entering wedge of you don't understand 1888 itself. He's saying to his people, you don't understand how church and state works. And then by August, he's shown us we'd forgotten Millerite history when there was a different sin in the cup of America. Ellen White talks about the cup being full. So there was a different sin in the cup of America in the Millerite history. Ellen White says in about 1868, Christ should have come back. We can easily demonstrate the sin that overthrew America in that history was not Sunday. The Sabbath Sunday issue was there because in Alpha history is always the reintroduction of the Sabbath. And God's people would have ended up persecuted for that, but that does not make it the sin that filled the cup. The sin that filled the cup in that history was slavery. We spoke in our previous study about how a waymark is a time period. We have three histories for modern Israel: the Millerite history, 1888 history, and then us. We have Millerites, we have 1888, and then us here. He started by showing us 1888 in February 2019, and the Millerite history in August, taking us back to slavery. The review of these two histories changed our understanding of the Sunday law in our history. So looking at the history here and then looking at the history here gave us a clearer understanding of what it should look like here. It was a period of time there, the 144,000 increase of knowledge, just as ours was a year, because a waymark is a story. So looking at that 2019 from February, she put it to August or September, it's a period of time. So we stand in the swelling of the understanding of the Sunday law. So we stand, this was January 2020, and we're well into 2021. So we're here now. But this is the swelling of the understanding of the Sunday law, heading towards this, the formalization. We also stand on the line of the priest down here, quite at the same place as a fractal, heading to the formalization. We know that this is the subject of marriage and equality. And that's another study we won't quite go into, but we touch on it some. But it is a study, and that comes from the study of understanding the king of the north and the king of the south being polar opposites. So that's a side note for a later date. We discussed 1798 as the time of the end. We decided to view it the way Ellen White does, that we are in the time of the end at each point from 1798. So all the way from 1798 to the second advent is the time of the end. In 1910, if Ellen White wants to say she's in the time of the end, that's accurate. Everything that occurred since 1798 is the time of the end. And what she pointed out before, it's not like you're in a time of the end ends, and then you got this period, and then you're in the time of the end. It's all the time of the end. God has given us different models to help break down this time period to make sense of what is happening externally. And that's where it was split to where you saw the Alpha and the Omega. He's lifting the curtain on the great controversy so we can see the players behind it, how this conflict has been fought in the time of the end. Now, if people want to write in the chat the three structures that I mentioned yesterday that he's given us, 3 different structures with 3 different themes to make 3 different points or 3 different overlaying applications. If you can think of any other structures, please write them in the chat. You guys don't have to do that unless you want to. If there's another structure that we take to the time of the end. So there were 3 structures that are looked at, that are discussed to take us to the time of the end, that take us through the time of the end. So the 3 that she mentioned in our first study, the first one was the structure of modern Israel. Someone said Egypt, Babylon, and Rome, and she did mention that in the previous study, but it wasn't talking about these structures here. So that's the structure we can see as evidence for modern Israel. I'm looking particularly for the 3 structures in the time of the end. What is modern Israel's 3 histories? So this is looking at modern Israel. What are those 3 histories? One is Millerite history, from the Millerites to 1888 to the 144,000. And it was a history of failure. The Millerites failed, the 1888 history failed. And then we know this history, going back to the studies of the Diadochi Wars, we know that this history will be a success. I think I linked that right. I think it was the Diadochi Wars. Takes you to understand that this 3rd history would be a success. And so the second structure that we looked at, so we want to look at what the second structure is that we looked at. That was a counterfeit. In the particular study that we just did, we didn't go into the counterfeit much. That was in another study. But the theme of, what's the theme of modern Israel? Who is the subject matter? You got God's people, or I'll just call them Adventism here. So that's modern Israel. The Millerites, failure, 1888 failure, and 144,000 is the line of success. And then the second one is, who is the subject of the counterfeit? The subject of the counterfeit is the papacy. And I'm not going to say anything more on that. It's just a comment, and some people may object to it. If Christ had returned in 1863, the papacy would have never gotten its boots on, would have been honored by Protestantism, but the papacy was not strong. That didn't happen. So in 1899, the papacy is able to ready itself. So the counterfeit begins its resurrection in 1899. So it's these 3 structures. You have the structure of modern Israel, the structure of the counterfeit, and then we'll look at this 3rd one, which is the one that we just spent a good portion of time on the previous study. And we see that they all follow the same path. That one is Adventism, one is the papacy, and one's going to be Protestantism. and they all follow the same path, but they're not aligned. You'll see that this was a different history, 1798 to 1863, you could put it. Then you have the 1888 history. 1899 is 100 years later. But what happens here is they're all ready at the same time. And that's what these lines have been teaching us, is that Protestantism is ready to go, the papacy is ready to go, and the 144,000 will be ready to go. And that studying these lines show us that clearly, which confirm that this is the end. How many histories are there for the papacy? There's 3 histories as well. It has to be 3. It's a counterfeit. So if it's counterfeiting, it has to be 3 histories. So what's the alpha history of the counterfeit? The alpha history was 1899 to 1945, up to the end of the Second World War. And that encapsulates both world wars. World War I and World War II are both a part of the first history. In the first history, it's World War I, World War II, and the first and second angels' messages. It's not World War I, first history, World War II, second history, World War III, third history. So it's World War I and World War II in this history, and the first and second angels' messages. Let's see. In the first history is World War I and II, and the first and second angels' messages. So World War III is the third history. 1798 is the work of William Miller and Samuel Snow, the first and second angels' messages. From 1798 to 1844, 46 years. 1899 to 1945 is also 46 years. That's the counterfeit line here. The years of the alpha history counterfeited. 1798, resurrected by the messages of Miller and Snow. 1844 was a disappointment and failure, and they are scattered. So it's a disappointment and failure, and they are scattered. 1899, resurrected by World War I and II. 1945 was a disappointment, and they are scattered. So it's 46 years here and 46 years here. It's a disappointment, and they are scattered. So you see a failure of the papacy to do their work. And who remembers what the failure was? Why did they fail in this history? Anybody?
They joined with the wrong king of the north.
Right. They chose the wrong beast. They chose the wrong beast.
Germany.
Yeah. So what is the counterfeit's second history of failure? And that's John Paul II. It's the history of 1989. It was the takedown of the Soviet Union. The angry Pope did not get what he wanted. So when does their history of success start? The papacy, their history of success starts in 2001. And that's the issue of Benedict and Francis. I don't remember the details. David Brown remembered that, and he brought it up to us last time when I asked. I don't know if anybody else remembers. Why did we put Benedict and Francis at 2001? I know it's a really simple, obvious answer, and I'm drawing a blank. Does anybody remember? Because Francis wasn't there. But actually, when Benedict was chosen, Francis was among those to be chosen at the same time. I do remember that. But it was Francis that was, it was Benedict that was chosen. Okay, so the 3 histories of the counterfeit is 1899 to 1945, and that time period was Pope Pius the 12th. 1989 is John Paul II. In 2001 is Benedict and Francis. And so the counterfeit is getting closer. The third model taught yesterday was In God We Trust, which is the subject of this camp meeting. And what is the theme of this structure? We have Adventism, this modern Israel, the papacy is the counterfeit, and which is the theme of our third structure. The papacy is church and state. This third structure is Protestantism. We see 3 histories in this structure. Both the study of last year and this document say there are three movements to make America a Christian nation. In Millerite history, they didn't really need to do this. Just after the Second Great Awakening, it practically was, but when that history is a failure, Protestantism mobilizes in three histories. And what are these three histories here for Protestantism? And we've already been going over them, but going over them repeatedly and repetition helps us to understand it. So you have 1863 to 1900, the Christian Amendment Movement. You have 1863 was the formation of the National Reform Movement, and taking you all the way through the 1888 history. And then the 1950s, it started back in the 40s, was Judeo-Christian nationalism. And then 79 to the Sunday Law, or at least to the Sunday Law, is the new Christian right. So you've got these three structures. All can be traced from the time of the end, 1798. The first structure is modern Israel in three histories, and that modern Israel is Adventism. The second structure is the structure of the counterfeit. Again, three histories, two histories of failure, and then a history of success. And the third, and that's the papacy, and the third is Protestantism. And the theme there was, the structure is in God we trust. And the three movements where the right, the evangelicals, mobilize to make this a Christian nation. So we can see that, like I pointed out, this is 1798 to 1844, this is 1899 to 1945, this is 1863 to 1900. They're not lined up, if that makes sense, if I'm saying that the right way. These histories are not lined in alignment. And then you have the same thing here. This is like 100 years apart. And then this is in the 50s. So they're not lined up. But in our history, the time of the end that we know to be 1989, we see that all of these histories are lined up at the same time, mobilized to do their work. So like the two histories above them, the two structures, the first history was failure. What Ellen White was framing as would be a success when she says the movements now in progress will imminently introduce the Sunday Law. That was a paraphrase. Just as she said back in Millerite history that Christ would return in your lifetime. And that's another study where those quotes were all looked at in detail, how she was talking about where Christ would have come back. She says she makes a quote that he would have come back, and it's 1868, I think it is, and then also in 1910, I can't remember if it was 1900s, 1905. She makes another comment. So there were two histories that he could have come back. She frames this as if they were a history of success. She has to. Then in the 1888 history, or the second history, all through the Great Controversy, she frames that as a history of success. She has to. But they failed. Jones and Wagner failed. So in the Protestant structure, we have a history of failure, a history of failure, and a history of success. So all three of these structures have a history, a first history of failure, a second history of failure, and a third history of success. So noting the comments somebody put in the chat, if people understand other structures to break down the time of the end history, I'm not saying they don't exist. Please mention them as you think of them. I don't think the 10-year history can be used as a structure to break it down this way. And I'm not sure, I don't remember what 10-year history she was talking about here. Everything people are mentioning, I would suggest give us more information on these structures. Ancient Israel is going to give us an explanation on the structure of modern Israel. Ancient Israel being from Moses to the time of Christ. So another comment on the chat, what's in the chat. The question was, do we have more than these structures to break down the time of the end? And I'm suggesting that the ones so far mentioned give more detail onto these three structures. There might be something to the three woes, so that's a good point. I'm suggesting that these three are the key structures God has given us to break down. Adventism, the papacy, and Protestantism. However much they differ in time in these first two histories of failure. Now they all run together because we're heading to a point of conflict at the Sunday Law. So all three groups are mobilized. When I started a series in May, I was determined that the subject of study needed to be Millerite history. And I found it personally frustrating when I kept getting distracted from that in what seems to be this study of just this history of Protestantism. I couldn't verbalize it, but God was moving us from the structure of modern Israel to the structure of In God We Trust. And I found that frustrating. So looking back, I fought him a little because I wanted to talk about modern Israel and not In God We Trust. I guess referencing Elder Parmenter's presentation, it encourages me when we get out of line. God kicks us back onto the path he wants us to take, even if we get frustrated with him. So she's expressing her desire, thinking that she needed to study Millerite history, and he kept pointing her to the study of In God We Trust. We did lay out Millerite history at the Oceana camp meeting. We did need to understand Millerite history, especially in the context of the election. But where we were particularly meant to be turning to was the history of Protestantism. So at this camp meeting, it's the third structure that we are revisiting, which is why we have sent out this document, the document we've been referencing, How the Constitution Became Christian, as study material, which, as you all know, covers the exact same three histories, which I would suggest is from a very reliable source. I don't know if you have read the other material of Jared A. Goldstein. I haven't yet, but I'm particularly interested in this one on nationalism. And that's the one that that traces nationalism to Donald Trump. So the time of the end history, there are three structures, 1, 2, and 3, helping us to break down failure, failure, success of Adventism, of the counterfeit or the papacy, and of Protestantism. We're going to work through this document. The whole of it cannot be read. So a couple of disclaimers. When I read, I'm likely to be paraphrasing. Some might be paraphrased, some might be summarized, and we're going to have to skip large portions to get to the points. I'm going to assume or hope that people have been able to read it, and the parts I skip are not insignificant. Please don't ignore the parts that I skip, but we're limited on time. Then we will supplement as we go through from three sources, and those are the sources she mentioned. A.T. Jones' writings, I can't remember the name of the first one, but it had to do with the Covenanters, I believe. And then also the book, The Evangelicals. So the second document, it discusses the Covenanters. That's the one I was trying to remember. I still remember the title on it, but it discusses the Covenanters, the most relevant branch of Protestantism to this history. We're going to go into the Covenanters and discuss their founder, who was John Knox in Scotland. Then we'll also use A.T. Jones, and then the book, The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America by Francis Fitzgerald. I won't be quoting that book because it's difficult, but I'll be making some blanket statements, and I'll try to say this is found in the book, if that's a reference. So we'll turn to the document, How the Constitution Became Christian. This document begins with an introduction. Then it's divided into three parts: the introduction, the fight to make the Constitution Christian, the first history of 1863-1900s, then Judeo-Christian nationalism of the Eisenhower era in the second history of the 1950s, the constitutional nationalism of the New Christian Right, 1979 to the Sunday Law history, and then a conclusion. So the document itself is divided into three parts. So it has an introduction, it has the three histories, and then a conclusion. We're going to go through the introduction fairly quickly. If you have heard Elder Parmenter talk about the principles of good writing, you say what you're going to say, you repeat it, and then you repeat it again. Jared A. Goldstein follows this exactly. He says practically everything in the introduction, but I don't want to go into too much detail there because we're going to work through each history in 3 parts. Even though there's so much in the introduction that is loaded, we'll keep moving. The first sentence he says, movements dedicated to make the United States a Christian nation have been a recurring feature in American politics for more than 150 years. Now in the first history, 1863 to 1900, they denounced the Constitution as a godless document, unworthy of a Christian nation. Hang on one second. Unworthy of a Christian nation, and fought to amend it. In contrast, our history that came together in the 1970s, they hold up the Constitution as the highest expression of the nation's Christian identity. The purpose of this document is to discuss how it went from being hated or a godless document to being lauded. In the third paragraph, I gotta watch the timer. Somebody help me watch the time. Okay, we got about 15 more minutes. In the third paragraph, they'll understand the conflict over the Constitution by discussing these 3 movements. So it was a gradual thing from being called a godless document to we need to amend it to our history where they're lauding it as a Christian document in a Christian nation. He showed it how these movements were different. In the first history, they hate the Constitution. In our history, love the Constitution. Now he wishes to make the point that they're similar. They follow a similar pattern. I hope you can see he's taken 3 histories. He began by contrasting them, but now he's going to compare them. He's using the rules of parable teaching. He's not a person that's in this movement or knows anything about this movement, but he's using the rules of parable teaching. He's going to compare and contrast. He's going to look at the similarities and he's going to look at the differences. And what he's tracing is how the Constitution in their eyes went from a godless document to a document that views this nation as a Christian nation. And how they're similar, he's going to say that there's a dominant religious group. They observe a perceived threat to their dominance, so they mobilize. They believe that their Christian devotion is part of America's essence. So any perceived threat to their Protestant faith, they can interpret as a nationalistic attack on America's identity itself. And they have to preserve their identity by either amending the Constitution in the first history when they hated it, or by interpreting it their way when they love it in our history. And this dominant religious group, she briefly mentioned when she talked about the Covenanters. The Covenanters can be traced back to Calvinism and John Knox in Scotland. And they believe that they are the true church and that Christ has given the world over to them to be in charge of. It sounds so much like Catholicism. Not their religion so much, but their universalism. In the last paragraph, through this recurring pattern in which a threat to group status is understood in nationalist terms. So there's nationalism through this because how they interpret national identity. So this recurring pattern is a dominant religious group seeing a group threat. They mobilize, they make demands based on the Constitution, and then they begin to fight. So in each history, they see a perceived threat against their dominant reign, they mobilize, make demands on the Constitution, and begin to fight. And they do the same thing here, and they've done the same thing here. So what we need to know is the issues of each of these histories. Compare and contrast. This one plus this one will help us to understand this one. I'm going to skip the first part of the introduction. We won't go into the fine details of how they fight over the Constitution, but we'll go to page 262. I just want to highlight a couple of points from each page. Their fight over the identity of the nation all centers on the Constitution. So page 262, that first paragraph, beginning as this article begins to show. So the quote, as this article begins to show the relationship between the Constitution and national identity is quite different than conventional wisdom suggests. Rather than defining what it means to be American, the Constitution has become the battleground on which disputes over national identity are fought. So people look at the Constitution to define what it means to be American, but it's like people expect too much of it, because as he says, a libertarian will read a libertarian Constitution, a progressive will read a progressive Constitution, and others find in the Constitution confirmation that the nation is defined by race, ethnicity, and religion. Nativists read a nativist constitution, while white supremacists read a white constitution. So same constitution, but it's how you read it, how you interpret it. So it could depend what you want to see, and each group might have a point. So each group takes their different points and they fight over this battleground, over their right to fight what America is in its essence. How readest thou? Or we see the same thing with parable methodology in understanding the message. As Jesus began to speak to the disciples in parables, we know in 2014, he began to speak to us in parables. And it comes down to how readest thou? Because what we see is we will be fighting there, thus saith the Lord, using the methodology of parables to understand the message for today. So it'll be a battle between the methodology of parable teaching, understanding things through the methodology, versus a literal reading of literal thus saith the Lord. So one of the issues is people expect too much. When white supremacists read a white constitution, they have a point. It's this nationalism, this idea of American exceptionalism that lifts up this document well above the status it should have. And I've never heard anyone try to frame this better than Barack Obama, when he describes it as a star you'll follow. But he describes it as everything in motion, not with the idea that Amy Coney Barrett has, that they have to interpret it as it was understood and meant in 1798, when it was written by white nationalists and sexist nativists. So it was a moving document, a living document that was to grow over time. And I know I didn't paraphrase that correctly, but I think you guys got the idea. So they're going back and saying it's all important. What it meant then, Barack Obama is saying that this is a flawed document and everything is in motion, which means we need to reinterpret, amend anything necessary. But they're all fighting over the Constitution because Barack Obama will look at it and pick out all the progressive parts and see that as evidence that America must head in a progressive direction. It's the battleground. So it was written by these white nationalists, these nativists, and it needed to progress to come to its highest ideal. And that's the point that Barack Obama was making. In the next 3 paragraphs, he's going to briefly summarize the 3 parts that are each discussing these 3 histories. Part 1 looks at the 19th century movement to amend the Constitution to proclaim national devotion to Jesus Christ. As this chapter will discuss, some evangelical Christians rejected the Constitution because they considered it a godless document that lacked any expression of religious devotion. And if you think about the document as itself, that there was supposed to be religious freedom, and then you're not to have the union of church and state in there, then it was rightly written. But they're claiming it's a godless document and religion needs to be expressed in it. This began during the Civil War and continued to the end of the century. They organized a national movement to make the Constitution Christian because their national identity was, as they perceived, threatened by other groups. He lists the 4 threats, and at that time, the threats were the Catholics, the Jews, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the religious freethinkers. So in this history here, there were these threats, these 4 threats: the Catholics, the Jews, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the religious freethinkers. We'll go further into that. The last sentence of that paragraph: the nation's Christian Protestant identity could be saved, the movement argued, if only the Constitution could be made Christian. So they perceived the Catholics, the Jews, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the religious freethinkers as threatening their dominance. The subject of introducing a Sunday law was only a small part of that fight, one part that was not the whole. The fight was to amend that Constitution and make it reflect their religious identity. Then he goes on to part 2, the second history, which looks at Judeo-Christian nationalism, this history here, of the Eisenhower era. We might discuss this in a little more detail as to why they start using Judeo-Christian rather than in the first history, Christian, because we mark the middle history, 1950s, as taking off in 1848. Let's see, as taking off in 1848. I think I have that wrong. I think that's supposed to be 1945 there. The problem is they want to force America into their Protestant structure, and they have to be very careful how they do that, because it's a few short years after 1945, the 50s here, after 1945, and another church-state relationship just tried to do a similar thing. Nazi Germany had tried to force its identity on its population, and Hitler gave a bad name to this identity of Christian. So they have to step very carefully in the 1950s to show they are against not just communism, but also fascism. They're going to soften what they're doing by identifying themselves with the persecuted Jews, try and separate themselves from Hitler. In 1798, Protestants are not talking about the need for a state of Israel, but they had developed that message, their understanding of the Battle of Armageddon, the need for Israel to be a nation, which occurred in 1948. That was what it was supposed to be, was in the previous slide, was 1948. So you've got this issue with the Jews in this history after 1945. So they start to bring in and identify with Judeo and call it a Judeo-Christian nation. Going back to that paragraph, beginning with little opposition, about 2/3 down, they succeeded in some way what they requested. Both histories of failure here had some small successes. They succeeded in adding the phrases "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" to the national motto. But then they failed. The whole movement ground to a halt with some key Supreme Court decisions in that history. Then, as we'll discuss, so much happens in the 1960s, so much to perceive as a threat. Part 3 examines the constitutional vision of the new Christian right, the Christian conservative movement that coalesced in the 1970s, led by televangelist Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. He's going to again make the contrast They are going to lift up the Constitution as a charter for a Christian nation compared to the first group that condemned the Constitution. So this group called it a godless Constitution, and this group's going to lift it up as a Christian Constitution. So on page 264, he's going to explain or compare these histories, the repeating pattern you can identify in each. I think we'll have to pause here. The first step they take is they identify a group threat. Let me just read a couple more and then we'll stop. They identify a group threat. There's a threat to their national identity, to their version of Protestant preeminence. They structure this around a nationalistic framework. In the first threat, the first step, I'm Jerry Falwell. I consider that what I am as a white evangelical male is prototype. Do we understand the concept of a prototype? It's that mold. Everything has to fit into that mold. You want to invent something, you create this structure, this thing, you create this pin. Someone says a template, and that's a good example. Now, everything coming after this has to look like this pen. She was holding up a pen or a template, a first model of something from which other forms are just copies. So Jerry Falwell would see himself as a prototype of what an American should be. That prototype is under threat. This isn't just a religious threat. This is an attack on America itself. So they're going to cast this around a nationalistic framework. And then they're going to try to preserve their status through demands based on the Constitution. And they'll look to that document to entrench their identity. Okay. So we are on slide number 39. I'm going to make note of that so that we might pick this up Friday night. I got to look at the schedule because I think Friday night could be easily adjusted, but I'll verify that. But first of all, you guys are all still there, right? Do I still have it on share screen? Oh, wow. I lost you guys.
Oh, we're still here.
Yeah, I know you're still there, but I got rid of my slideshow and that's where share screen was. And I had to figure out how to stop share screen. Okay, so I want to pause there, and I know it's a lot of information. Good review for most of us, but I want us all to be keeping in prayer, Leonard, for various reasons. But that the Lord would help him to understand the things that we're going to share with him. And I'd like to ask you, Leonard, are you able to be here Friday night? If not, I'll adjust when I continue this.
Yeah, I should be.
Okay, that would be good because the Sabbath is pretty much set. I don't remember. I got to double check. Christine might be here and listening and hear that. I know I looked at it this morning, but I forgot already what was on the schedule for Friday night.
For Friday is the study on Isaiah 50 and 51.
Okay. So so we can finish up this study and then we'll try to go into Isaiah. It won't take us too much longer, I don't think, to finish this study. Do you have any questions, Leonard, or would you rather talk about them later with me? Either way is fine.
I don't have no questions right now. I'm just trying to follow up on everything.
Okay. So the key things is the tracing of the three structures, but in particular, tracing the history of Protestantism. But having recognized that there are three histories in Adventism, three histories in the line of the counterfeit, the papacy, and three histories in Protestantism. And the Protestant line shows their attack not attack, but seeing their national identity, how they perceive it to be threatened. And in each history, there's a different threat. And so each history has a different attack to fight that threat. And so eventually it leads us to the third history that we're actually living in. So that's the key things to try to remember out of that, but also knowing that within Protestantism, there is, just like in Adventism, there's a conservative liberal split. And most of Adventism is following the train tracks of conservative Protestantism. And it was actually really, this part was really easy to see by one, stepping out of conspiracy theories, but two, who would be the likely one, the obvious one, to do this union of church and state? It would have to be the religious right. So it would have to be the Republicans and the right. And so Adventism is looking to the UN and the liberals to bring in a Sunday law, and they're looking the wrong direction. And God had to arrest the attention even of this movement, because this movement pre-2019 was looking in that wrong direction as well. And so he's got us turned around, looking in the right direction and opening up these histories that we can trace, that can show the work of Protestantism in their three different histories, two histories of failure, and then this history of success. And the failure, success pattern came from the Midnight Cry message and the understanding of, I'm pretty sure it was the Diadochi Wars. Out of the Diadochi Wars, kind of see that little square graph with all the blocks in it, where you'd see the history of failure, success. If I have that wrong, somebody remembers better, help me out. But anyways, so no questions. And like I said, you can call me anytime. And hope everybody was okay with the review. Anybody else have any comments they want to make?
Good review.
Good review. Hey, repetition is good for us, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you, as we have learned along this journey, how many things, when you said that we have much to unlearn and much to learn, you have shown that time and time again with us. You took us from a very fearful position we were in and completely looking the wrong direction. You've given us what would be considered a vaccine against conspiracy theories by teaching us the two streams of information, that we might see how those two streams have steered the work that is going on in this world, to culminating to, at least to this point, to what we witnessed on January 6th. And that's only the beginning. The damage of conspiracy theories has so infected people. And I'm thankful for the Midnight Cry message that gave us that vaccine we needed through this increase of knowledge, that we could turn from those things, and how you've guided us to understand how we were still worshiping the Apis bull with idolatry hidden within our own hearts, and how you have sought to bring us free from all those things, that we might continue to progress forward and see more and more of your character, your true character, because it's your true character. It will be seen in your people. And as we saw in the 1888 history, what we missed was the work of A.T. Jones in defending the rights of all people, not mingling church and state, defending the rights of all people. And that work will be our work, to defend the rights of all people. So when you go to set the captives free, it will be those that are oppressed and persecuted by the horrendous laws that are made against people out of the eyes of this white Christian nationalism, out of sexists, denying the rights of women to choose, denying homosexuals their rights, all in their eyes of morality. Our work will be in defending the rights of all. And we will be revealing, by your grace and mercy, your character as it will shine bright in this dark world. We thank you for the blessing and privilege to be a part of this. We ask a special blessing upon Leonard and his wife as the trials that they are going through at this time. And may you help him to be able to study with us as much as he possibly can and bless him with understanding. We thank you and praise you, and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.